When I first began this project, I soon realized that issues of prejudice are not easy to define as right or wrong. But if we look at the history of discrimination and listen to various points of view, we can begin a discussion that may lead to a greater understanding of prejudice.
Prejudice comes from ignorance. Prejudice also comes from tradition.
A lot of it's lack of exposure, and a lot of it's fear.
I think it's coming from the home.
The point about prejudice is that it's an attitude not based on real experience and real fact.
Spoken from the situation all night.
It is prejudging, predetermining, usually based on erroneous or false information about other people.
Prejudice is something all of us carry around, I'm sure, just based on what we might have heard, you know, things we picked up through the media, things we might have heard from our parents. And so it's really prejudging. It's not giving a person or a group a chance to really, you know, be judged on their own sort of qualities. But we say, we know what they're like, oh, we don't want to, you know, have anything to do with them.
Discrimination is the denial of rights, privileges, what have you, of anyone because of either the skin color, they don't wear their hair the way I do, they don't act the way I do, they don't come from the same place I do, they're not on the same economic level that I am on. That is discrimination.
Discrimination is the actual act of not allowing equality. Okay? Prejudice is what's in your head. Discrimination is your behavior.
It's treating certain people or groups differently from other people or groups. It's not allowing them the same access, the same opportunity. If you're talking about personal discrimination, say you are an employer, and you basically don't like working with people of a certain race or a certain national group, it means basically that you make sure those people do not join your workforce. So it's treating certain people, groups differently based on really prejudice.
I grew up in a very conservative household. There was a lot of racism exhibited by my father and my mother and grandparents, and I think I grew up with an aversion to that.
I did not really grow up with bitterness toward white people, but because of the way that my grandmother was treated. But it did color our attitude in terms of trust of white people.
I am partially deaf. I am completely deaf in the left ear, and I have only partial hearing in the right ear. And I know through my own experiences that I have been prejudiced against by several people, prejudiced against to try and get jobs, and even prejudiced against by doctors who told me there would be some things that I would never do.
I've been discriminated against, not only because I'm a Vietnam veteran, but I have lost many jobs to women.
I find that I have prejudice as well, mainly in terms of responding or reacting to attitudes about me as a woman of color.
I walk by a car. I've seen a person actually sit in the car, looking at and just act like they're yawning and lock the door with their elbow.
I am very much concerned about racial matters. I'm concerned about my heritage. I'm concerned about preserving it. I much prefer the company of other people of European descent rather than Chinese or Africans or Indians or what have you.
Throughout history, many different national, religious, and ethnic groups have been the targets of organized bigotry. Bigotry is a single-minded dedication to one's own race, religion, political beliefs or opinions, and an intolerance of any difference. In its most extreme form, bigotry can be deadly. In the 1930s and 40s, Adolf Hitler and his followers, the Nazis, believed they could create a master race by exterminating people they said were inferior. During what is known as the Holocaust, over 8 million people were killed, 6 million of whom were Jewish. The deliberate destruction of a people because of their race, religion, cultural or political association is called genocide. When European explorers arrived on this continent, there were millions of people already living here. They belonged to over 100 different nations, each with its own language, religion, and traditions. The settlers called them all Indians.
The American Indian was in this country perhaps thousands of years, and they never, ever acknowledged the one true God.
For centuries, settlers and their descendants took land from the native people and forced them to relocate hundreds of miles away. The United States government slaughtered buffalo so that the Indians, who depended on that animal for survival, starved to death.
There are also cultures that were decimated and that we will never, know of again.
Discrimination against black people in the United States dates back to the early history of the country, when Africans were forced to come to America as slaves. Slaves had no rights. They were considered property, not human beings. A slave could not choose where to live or who to marry. It was even illegal for a slave to learn how to read. They did not get paid for their labor, and if they refused to work, they were beaten or killed.
My grandfather had good slaves. They didn't bother him. And so he had only pleasant, well, not pleasant necessarily, but good memories of his slave master. But my grandmother's people were terrible. They separated my grandmother from her sister. She never saw her again. In fact, my uncle ran away so many times as a slave till my mother said he didn't have the same skin he was born with on his back. He would run away and they'd beat him, he'd run away and they'd beat him again. But he still didn't give up. He kept running away until slavery ended, and he was living when slavery ended.
But even after slavery was outlawed, discrimination continued. African Americans were denied equal opportunities in education, jobs, and housing. In nearly every aspect of American life, there were two standards, one for whites and an inferior one for blacks.
When I was a child, I could not eat a banana split. I didn't know what one was because although the drugstores and the dairy stores had them, black folk couldn't go in and purchase them.
Colored people and white people, that's the way they'd have the signs up there for use, And the bathrooms were that way, and the drinking fountains, and the restaurants had that on the door.
Restrooms, dining areas, the educational system, the transit system, really everything on the whole. It was separate. Yes, it was separate, but in no way was it equal.
Unlike the Africans who didn't immigrate to the U.S. by choice, most people who arrived did. Nevertheless, the most recent group of people to arrive in America was always disparaged and treated badly. Usually the people putting them down had been immigrants themselves, only they had been in this country a generation or two longer.
Always, the people who currently hold power feel a threat from newcomers. I'm sensitive to that because my grandmother was an immigrant. She was from Sweden. She married a German. My mother had to be pulled out of public schools during World War I because of all the hostility against the German immigrants. We, of course, had that happen again during World War II, particularly against the Japanese.
In 1941, Japan bombed U.S. naval bases in Hawaii, and the United States entered World War II. During the war, Americans smashed store windows and threw rocks at their neighbors because they were of German or Japanese descent. Peaceful citizens who had done nothing wrong found themselves under attack because of where they or their parents were born. Fearful of spies, the U.S. government rounded up Americans of Japanese descent, confiscated their businesses, and forced them from their homes. Japanese Americans were taken to detention centers, where a whole family lived in one room, without a kitchen or running water. They were forbidden to leave, or to communicate with the outside world. Ironically, many men of Japanese descent risked or lost their lives while fighting for the U.S. government, while back home, their families were being treated like the enemy. We have seen a similar reaction to war in our own time. In 1991, during the Persian Gulf War, there was a marked increase in violent crimes against Arab Americans. Many of the victims were American citizens, and none of them were associated with the government of Iraq, the country which the United States was fighting.
Since it's happened to about 12 different Arab stores in the area, I believe it's racist.
Our kids have been subjected because of their nationalities. They call them camel jockey. Iraqis go home.
When we discuss immigration, you know, we all have to remember that we are immigrants. Every single person on this continent today is an immigrant, except for the Native Americans.
The problem I think that really makes it sad right now is because they bring people come in by the thousands, by the millions, who never contributed a thing to the nation in the way of taxation or anything else. They haven't even worked yet. And a lot of them won't work, or they come in here for a free ride and get it. And that's not right. That does destroy our economy.
People want to say that this is my country and that I have a right to be here and I have a right to work. And when they see those jobs becoming fewer and fewer, they say, well, this is not your country and you need to go back where you came from.
It wasn't until the early 19th century that women even were able to receive an education. It wasn't until the 1920s that women received the right to vote.
My sister was the first person in our community to go to college. And I guess I was about the third to go to college. So at that time, the only thing we could be was a teacher or a nurse.
And during the 40s, we have this wonderful opportunity that occurs because we have a national need now for labor. And so women are actually encouraged to go into the workforce, and they prove they can do it.
At first, women go into service jobs, releasing men for the Army and for war industries. Employers find that women can do many jobs as well as men, some jobs better.
Men and women are complementary. They're not equal, they're complementary. They have complementary abilities. That's the way God designed us. That's the way we evolved for millions of years. We evolved to complement one another. Man evolved as the breadwinner and the protector. Woman evolved as the childbearer and the nurturer.
Well, what does equal mean? I mean, are we talking equal opportunity? Are we talking equal weight? You know, equal is abstract. So usually in America, when we say equality, we mean equality of opportunity.
We still do not have an Equal Rights Amendment. We still do not have equity in pay. Women still bump up against those glass ceilings, you know, in their place of employment. Women still are perceived as being the responsible person in the family for raising the children and for keeping the home together, in addition to having to work and bring home the bacon too.
And I think there are some things women ought to stay out of, but I think they ought to be given equal treatment where they've got equal jobs. Like if you've got women principals or women doctors, I don't think there should be a difference in the salaries and things that they earn. Just like I don't think it should be a difference in the black and white salaries. And they both are the same thing. They're fighting. Women and blacks are really fighting for the same thing, except that women have made a lot more progress than blacks off of the coattails of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement.